Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We bring together the latest research in linguistics, language acquisition, and biblical studies to better understand the biblical languages and ultimately the biblical text. As always, this episode is brought to you by Biblingo, the premier solution for learning, maintaining, and enjoying the biblical languages. Visit biblingo.org to learn more and start your 10-day free trial.
I am Kevin Grosso, your host for this episode, and I'm excited to talk with Dr. Jennifer Noonan today about her book, A Handbook of Second Language Acquisition for Biblical Studies. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you. Good to be here.
So, just a little bit about Jennifer. She grew up on a small farm in northern Ohio. She completed her BA at Malone College in Canton, Ohio, and MA at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio. She received her PhD in Old Testament and Semitic languages from Hebrew Union College, which is where she met her husband, who teaches Old Testament and Biblical Hebrew for the Columbia Bible Seminary of CIU, which is Columbia International University. They have an 11-year-old daughter who is the extrovert of the family. And in addition to teaching Hebrew and Old Testament part-time for CIU, Jennifer also leads a Bible study for the CIU Seminary Women, gives piano lessons, and teaches online courses for Liberty University. Jennifer also enjoys cooking, photography, needlework, and traveling. And today we are talking about her book on second language acquisition within biblical studies, or I should say for biblical studies, because there wouldn't be that much to write about if we were just focusing on the research in SLA in biblical studies.
That's true. That's true.
So you are taking a separate field and trying to apply that to the biblical languages. So one obvious question about this is, why did you do this to begin with? Why did you write this book? What was the need?
Right. That's a great question. So when I was in seminary, I was a teaching assistant for the Hebrew classes, and my advisor, David W. Baker, gave me the opportunity to do an independent study on Hebrew pedagogy as it related to my work as a teaching assistant for the Hebrew classes. And it really sparked my interest and led to me going on for PhD work and actually doing research. My dissertation was on methods of how you teach Hebrew using second language acquisition. I was able to take some classes in SLA from the University of Cincinnati that informed my research. And so it was just a really great progression of events that led me to be interested in that. And at the same time, there's been this growing interest in teaching languages, ancient languages, biblical languages, using insights from SLA research. And so there have been a lot of people trying different things, but not everyone's fully aware of what the research in SLA says and what's being done and what we know. So my book is trying to help bridge that gap between the two fields, as you were talking about earlier. But then also my husband and I have been brainstorming, and this is long-term goal yet. We're hoping to write a Hebrew grammar based on SLA methods and so on. And I realized that if I were to explain to the teachers why we made the choices we did, the introduction would be longer than the Hebrew grammar. So I decided to just write this as its own thing. And then hopefully when we get to writing our own grammar, I can refer back to it and say, hey, look at this book, and it'll tell you why we're making these choices for our book.
Yeah, that's great. So really, this is an introduction to another book, basically.
Hopefully,
yes.
God willing.
It's interesting, within the biblical studies SLA world, as you said, not many people know the research. I feel like people are kind of like, I don't know, 40 years behind. Basically, it stops at crashing, which is like, there's just been so much research done since then. And there's like, people are aware of like comprehensible input being important and that kind of thing. But there's just so much more to the field. So I was very excited to see, even in just your bibliography, you citing the people in the field, just the ones that the linguists would cite. So I think that's great. So can you give us an idea of who this book is for? I mean, is it more theoretical on, hey, how do we take modern SLA theory and apply it to the languages? Are you aiming it at teachers, or even just individual learners?
Well, both, primarily teachers, but individual learners as well, if it can help students go, oh, this is the best way to go about learning vocabulary or whatever it takes. But no, especially teachers, and it has a lot of theory. But I really try at the end of each chapter to give some very practical examples, one for Hebrew, one for Greek, one for Latin, to help teachers see, oh, this is how it would work in the classroom. This is what it might look like if I were to apply this principle to my class. And so, yeah, my primary audience is teachers, but certainly students, I think, could glean from it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And so when I was looking at it, and this is kind of how we'll structure our time together, you have 4 main sections: types of language knowledge and types of language instruction is 1, 2, raw materials of language acquisition, 3, language skill development, and 4, the role of the learner. So as you point out, you could easily write a book on any one of these sections, and there's just a ton that we could talk about. But hopefully at the end of this, our listeners will be able to see from a broad perspective, what's the conversation about in the field with explicit versus implicit knowledge, for example, which is the first section. So, when we talk about types of language knowledge, and I think this is something that is particularly pertinent to Greek and Hebrew, because when I say something like, I know Greek, I would actually oftentimes mean something different by that than I know French, right? Which is very odd. But, today people, if they say, I know Greek, and then you ask them to start speaking it, they would almost certainly say, oh, I don't know it like that. Right. But if you said, I know French, and they asked you to start speaking it, they would expect you to speak. Right. And again, it's not speaking being the only thing, but just to point out that people actually mean something different when they say, I know a biblical language versus I know another language. So with that as the background, what is the distinction between explicit and implicit knowledge of a language?
Right. And we often talk about the difference between acquisition and learning. Like you learn about the language in terms of the Greek, but we're expected to acquire French. And so SLA, and kind of the purpose of this book, is under the premise that if you acquire and gain that implicit knowledge, you're going to be further ahead than people who just know about it. So the difference is the implicit knowledge is more unconscious, more intuitive. It's procedural knowledge. In other words, you can use it, you can do something with it, not just read it, but you can write it, you can speak it, you can hear it and understand it. And when you go to use it, you're editing your language output more by feel rather than by rules or paradigms. You just know that's how you say it in the language. And so you understand the knowledge. So that's implicit and more of your French example. But explicit knowledge is more of the conscious knowledge. It's the rules and the paradigms. It's formalized. It's something like you can speak and tell us what the rules are. Whereas with French, you may not know what the rules are. You just know that's how you say it in the language. It's automatized. But in explicit knowledge, you know the rules, you can articulate the rules. And if you're going to use the language, you're using your conscious knowledge to say, okay, now I need a first person singular, whatever it is, to get it out, rather than just, I know how to say it and here it is. That's kind of the difference between implicit and explicit.
Yeah, and I think to your point, you don't need to know one to do the other, or vice versa. It's in fact, most English speakers, like if you start asking them explicit knowledge grammar questions, they have no idea. I always ask people what the passive participle break is, and every now and then someone will get it right. But it's like it's the kind of thing where people don't understand that all of the ways that we use language is really inside of us in a way that is different than what we talk about in Greek class or Hebrew class. And I think part of this too is that people often haven't learned a second language in this way or acquired a second language. And because of that, the assumption is that to acquire a second language, I learn a rule instead of I learn to use it in the same way that I use my first language. So one natural question from this, and I know that this is debated in the literature, but I would like to hear your opinion on it and why, is can explicit knowledge become implicit? So particularly here, I'm thinking like if I learn rules, for the katal form in whatever paradigm you want to give me, does that transfer to my ability to read the text? And then at the end of the day, the ability to read the text falls into the implicit knowledge category, to use the language in a certain way. So does that help me when I'm reading?
I would say yes, but in a very limited way. Now, if we go back to creation and some of these purists, they're going to say, no, absolutely not. There's no connection. You can't learn explicit and it magically turns into implicit. But I think it can have a limited positive function in that it gives you what you need to read the text. And the more you read, the more you're going to gain implicit knowledge of the language. And so it gives you an inroad, but it's not going to just magically turn into implicit knowledge. You have to use it. You've got to do, if nothing else, read a lot to make that happen.
Well, I think that's a really important point, is that it is the inroad, but it's not like if you only have that, it doesn't mean you can read. In fact, you can't read, right? Like it's not enough. And it's something that you mentioned, Krashen, saying no. And I think part of this too is in the SLA literature, the debate on second language acquisition versus first language acquisition. Those who tend to think that second language acquisition should be identical or closer in form to first language acquisition, I think would tend to answer this question no, because kids don't learn the rules, right? Kids never explicitly learn whatever paradigm it is. But we're not kids, right? And what I always tell people too is like, well, my 1-year-old, he's just now starting to speak. He's 13, 14 months. But it's taken him that long, and he can say, bah for bah, or ball for ball. It's like, okay, like I don't want to be that slow, and of course there's like, other reasons for that. But just to point out that like it's not the same thing, right? Because we are actually at we have different cognitive capacities at 32 years old. I do than my 1-year-old. And so I can actually see a paradigm and make explicit knowledge from that paradigm, right? And that's not something that he can do.
Right. And we have a capacity for understanding symbols and writing that kids have to grow into and learn. And so that's just going to be faster and different than learning your first language.
Right. But to your point, if you don't use that knowledge implicitly, it will never become implicit, right? I mean, that's the
right, exactly.
That's the issue. So in your opinion, then, what should the role of explicit knowledge of the grammar be in the classroom, specifically for the biblical languages? So I'm asking this too, thinking about the different ways that the biblical languages are used outside of just reading. So in commentaries and whatever. Are the biblical languages special in the sense that we talk about the grammar a lot? And how should that factor into the language?
Yes, absolutely. And if for no other reason than the fact that the resources use the meta language, they use the grammar terms to talk about the language, we need to have some grammar instruction. They're not going to be able to access the tools if they don't have some grammar. That's not the ideal way to get to acquisition, but it's necessary for where we are right now. But at the same time, there is a value for learning grammar in that it's the refining and the accuracy that it brings to our understanding of the language. If you focus just on implicit acquisition, you're going to be very good and fluent at being able to read and write, listen, speak, but you may not be accurate. You may miss some of the details if you haven't got at least a little bit of grammar to focus and go, oh, that's why we do it that way, or whatever, or, you miss this ending, even though you're communicating and it makes sense, but you need at least a little focus on grammar to get it precise.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because one of the other things I think of is like, I mean, part of precision is research, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm going to research a certain word or grammatical form, I have to both be accurate about the meaning and then also precisely describe it. And that's the kind of thing where I can't write a journal article and say, well, I know the language really well, and this is my intuition. I have to have a grammatical reason, for this interpretation rather than the other, when two interpreters disagree, right? Which happens all the time.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I like that about accuracy. So let me switch gears now. So this is just language knowledge. So what we've said so far is basically these two things, explicit and implicit knowledge of a language, are separate things, and you can have one without the other and vice versa, but they both might be able to help each other. But obviously today, where we are in a language classroom, it's 90 to 95% explicit, right?
Yes.
And so we're not getting enough implicit.
Right.
And so the second part of your book is the raw materials for
Right.
language acquisition, which
Mhm.
you have under two headings of input and output.
Right.
So this is just, now we're talking about just implicit knowledge.
Right.
What are the unique roles of language input and output, and what are language input and output, to begin with?
Sure. So language is comprised of 4 skills: speaking, listening, reading, writing. And so the input skills are listening and reading. The output skills are speaking and writing. Now, in terms of input, it is just essential. Everybody in SLA is talking about input, and specifically comprehensible input, as being what is essential for acquisition, because you can get a huge amount of input. Just go online and listen to somebody in another language. But if it's not comprehensible, you're not going to get anything out of it, and you're not going to start learning the language that way. You need input that you can understand. And Creation's input hypothesis has really kind of set the target for SLA research. Everybody's looking at, how do you do this? The input hypothesis says that learners are going to learn the best if they have input that is 1 degree more difficult than their current level. Okay. Now, everybody's got their ideas of what 1 degree means, but this idea that you have input that's comprehensible but has just a little bit more that you don't know, then you can acquire it. And so there's been all kinds of research being done about, how do you do that? How do you make the input comprehensible? How do you add comprehensible input? How do you change the quality of the input so it's not just comprehensible, but so that you can derive the most intake from that input possible? So input it's just essential for language acquisition. And on a very basic level, I mean, it's just common sense. If you've never heard the word sombrero, you're never going to acquire sombrero in your language, But the types of input and how it's delivered and how you work with it, that's so much of what's being done in SLA research right now. And just as I said, I don't think there's anybody who would disagree that it's just essential for acquisition.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. That is, it's easy. I mean, you say it's obvious, right? That if you don't hear the word sombrero, you can't learn the word sombrero.
Mhm.
But the point of that is, in order to progress in the language, you have to come into contact with new native speaker input. And there's really no getting around that.
Right.
And so that means that, this is one of the reasons why extensive reading, for example, is so important, because you just want as much input as you possibly can get. And that's one really good way to do it. It's just read as much as you possibly can. Obviously, the problem is, and I think this is where my feeling on some of the, trends within biblical studies is that the comprehensible part isn't always given enough attention.
Right.
So,
Right.
if I have a total immersion class, the big question is, they're getting a lot of input, which is great.
Mhm.
The big question is, how much is everyone understanding? A lot of times, I mean, in the classes that I've sat in on, or that I've actually done, there's some people that understand most of what's going on, and
Mhm.
some people that don't really understand anything. They will say after, I have no idea what just happened to me, which is like, okay, for those people, they didn't really progress, right?
Right. Right.
And then the problem is that there then becomes this ever widening gap,
Mhm.
because the people that comprehended it did progress, and the people
Right.
that didn't comprehend it didn't progress.
And it builds on itself. So if you get lost, anything else that comes after, you're lost.
Right. Yes, I completely agree. I think that's a really important point to the I+1, is what Krashen's formula. So output, that's input. So we know we need input for progression in the language.
Could I go back just
Yeah.
to input?
Yeah.
One point you made that I think is really important is that it's native speaker input, or at least meaning bearing input. In other words, we're not talking paradigms, we're not talking isolated forms, we're talking actual sentences and stories, and not the grammar memorization, but actual language being used for what it's supposed to be used for, which is communication.
Yeah, for sure. And you're right too, that I would be a total hypocrite to say only native speaker input would count, because we have a lot of stories in Biblingo of, just like baby Hebrew and Greek,
Right.
because you can't read full native
Right.
speaker input, it's just like, that's what it is. But the assumption is that even that input would not be introducing errors, or that you could move beyond those at later stages, just to point out that like you still need accurate input, to acquire that language.
That's right.
But yeah, native speaker would be too strong. So output, why is this important? Especially given that the only thing we have in terms of the biblical languages is input, right?
Right.
We have texts with which we can get input,
Mhm.
but we don't have a speaker to practice on for output. And I know obviously some people speak the biblical languages, like
Right,
I'm
right.
one of them that could, carry on some conversation in it, but it's not the same, again, as a native speaker.
Yeah.
For linguists, none of us would count as real native speakers of that language, no matter how good your intuitions are, So
Right.
tell us about output.
Well, output really is important for language acquisition for several reasons. So one of them is once you've gotten your input, you've gotten it into your brain, you've processed it, the only way to know for you or your teacher or whoever wants to know whether you've actually acquired it is if you can produce it. Nobody can get inside your brain and see, did you actually learn it or not? Until you produced output, then you know that you've acquired it. Otherwise, it's just rattling around in there and nobody's sure. And so it's really helpful for both learners and teachers if you can produce that output to go, oh, yes, you got this, but not that. Or you've got the general idea, but it needs to be refined a little more, that kind of thing. And so that's one reason why output really is important. Another reason, and this is related, it gives the teacher the opportunity for very focused feedback. In other words, if the learner produces something, it's incorrect, the teacher can go, oh, that's what we're missing, and go back and reteach or provide more practice in that area. But more than that, the people in SLA will tell us that you need not just input, but you also need interaction for acquisition to occur. You can get all kinds of input, but if you don't do something with it, and particularly communicate, then you're not going to be as effective at learning. And of course, communication requires two people. One of them has to produce output and one input to dialogue in the language. And so it's necessary for that aspect as well. And not only that, but in the context of that, and this is, I think, part of why they say that this interaction is important, is because you can adjust in real time. In a conversation, you can make the adjustments needed to comprehend. And so if one person's saying something, the other person does not understand it, they can say, wait, stop, slow down, say it again. And right there on the spot can change, adjust, create comprehensible input if it was incomprehensible, and make the adjustments on the spot so that very quickly you can get what you need to learn, to acquire, to understand, because comprehension is part of what fuels, and the need for comprehension, part of what fuels acquisition.
So these are all things I feel like, again, if you were to argue for learning French, okay, I can understand we need output. What about for the biblical languages where we don't have anyone to talk to? My understanding of what you're saying is that basically output serves input in this case, because I don't actually need to have a conversation with anyone in biblical Greek or Hebrew because there is no one to talk to. That's a native speaker,
Right.
But I do have native speaker written material, right, that I want to interact with. And so what I'm hearing you say is including output is the best way to access that native speaker written material in a meaningful way. Is that?
Yes, absolutely. I would totally agree with that.
So not necessarily the case that like we wouldn't necessarily say, okay, I just want to be able to say, can I go to the bathroom in biblical Hebrew, right? Like,
right.
and I don't need to have that conversation with someone.
Mm-hmm.
But if I practice the language using these
Mm-hmm.
kinds of methods, then
Right.
I will have a better shot at understanding a written text.
Right, absolutely. And another thing which I didn't mention is having to produce output forces you to learn the language more deeply. You can recognize, oh, they're saying, hello, how are you? But if I have to produce hello, how are you? I have to think through what exactly is the form I need? How do I need to use it? And that act of producing is going to dig it in deeper in a way that just reading it would not.
Yeah, I agree. And so I took Greek and Hebrew at the Police Institute,
Oh,
and Eyal Nahum is the Hebrew teacher there.
okay.
And we would go back and forth and say, like, how do you say I agree in biblical Hebrew? Like, this is something that, like, it's actually pretty hard. There's like Tov Harava Be'enai is like kind of that, but
Right.
there's not really a good
They don't have a yes.
Oh, there's no yes for sure. There's no yes for sure. But like something like, yeah, just like a word for agree also is like there's not a really good word
Right.
for it. And there could have been, right? Probably. It's some, like, I'm sure we know that there was a situation where something like that would have need to
Right.
be communicated.
Right.
But it's just really hard to know what exactly would they have said. And when you start asking those questions, it
Right.
actually does give you a new window into the text, right? Because
Absolutely.
you're being very careful about, like, okay, what did they actually mean by these words, right? Did they mean
Right.
I agree, or did they mean something else? Which again, it's a different way to think about it. And to your point, I think much more accurate. So what about writing? Basically, we just focus on speaking, right?
Right. Right.
In terms of output. I think there's a lot of unique benefits to writing specifically for reading, but can you
Mhm.
tell us why should we include writing in our biblical language classrooms?
Right. Well, in addition to the things we've already talked about with speaking, it promotes accuracy, it promotes depth of knowledge, it gives you the opportunity to do some interaction, even though it's a little more separated by time and space. If you write letters, you have to wait a little while to get a response or to know if the person understood you or not. But in addition, when you write, you have a little more freedom to think about what you want to say. You lose the pressure of, oh, I got to give a response right now, where you have some space to really think about it, to formulate, to create, and you lose the intimidation factor of having to speak it and produce it in real time.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Which can be it's really hard part of learning any language. I'm on the spot and I have to respond to you and you're speaking really fast, that kind of thing.
Right.
One other point that I think is important is spelling really helps you to read more quickly, and being able to recognize letters very, very quick
Mhm.
is really important for reading. And the best way to do that is to do the harder skill, right? Is
Mhm.
to write and use letters, produce letters yourself in ways that correspond to the correct sound. Not
Right.
meaningful, but which brings us to reading fluency, actually. So the big question with reading fluency to begin with is, what is reading fluency, and why is it important?
Right. So reading fluency, and this is a quote from William Grabe, who is like the guru of SLA, second language reading. He says it's the ability to read rapidly with ease and accuracy. So we're talking about not just quick but accurate reading, and this fluency really is a prerequisite for comprehension and ultimately interpretation, which is what most students are looking for when you're looking at biblical language classes. You want to be able to interpret the biblical text, and reading fluency is kind of a prerequisite for that.
So can you just draw this out a little more? I mean, I have read a lot of Marianne Wolf's work in this respect, who also works with reading fluency, but she works at it from the cognitive science perspective, also linguistics. When I first encountered this idea, it was kind of counterintuitive to me that reading speed correlated with reading comprehension. You would think that if you were going slower, you'd be able to understand more, but it's actually the opposite. If you can read faster, you can understand better. So why do we have that connection to begin with?
Well, it comes down to working memory. You only have so much in your working memory, just a few seconds really of working memory to work with. And so if you get partway through a sentence and have to slow down or stop to figure out what it is you're reading, you've lost the first half of the sentence in working memory. And so you've lost the ability to comprehend that whole sentence. If you can read faster, you can get through the whole sentence before you run out of working memory, and therefore you've been able to comprehend it and start the process of storage in long-term memory.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. One of the things it calls for is just getting very, very fast, right, at all of these different components of reading. So, in that respect, how do we do that? How do we get fast enough at reading to attain this sort of level of reading fluency?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. In technical terms, you're automatizing your lower level processes. That means you're trying to get automatic at recognizing words at decoding, word recognition, and getting those sped up fast enough so you can do them automatically, and that you don't have the burden of parsing every single word you run into. So if you can do that quickly and automatically, then you can move into the higher level processes, which involve comprehension and interpretation and that kind of a thing. So that's technically what's going on. But in practical terms, how you get there is doing a lot of reading, but not just doing a lot of reading, doing it a lot and trying to speed yourself up. It's almost like a game where you try to increase your reading speed as you go. And the more you can do that, the more you'll develop reading fluency.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things, honestly, I think about too is even just fluency with the letters. So a lot of people will just struggle with seeing a letter, right? And this is decoding, but just seeing a letter and being able to automatically produce that sound. And one of the things that I have noticed, I've gotten to the point in Greek and Hebrew where I can say the words out loud and think about something else. And that's actually exactly where you want to be, right? Like you want to be able to just be automatic. It takes no brain effort to look at a resh and pronounce, whatever you either trill or sound that you want, depending on your pronunciation. But that sort of thing, I think, is really what we're after. And this is what Marianne Wolf talks about, being able to really ultimately not think about something else, but think about the text more deeply, start making connections with things that otherwise you wouldn't have the brain power to connect, as you say, because all of your working memory is being taken up with, what is this letter again? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But we only spent a couple weeks, or a week on the alphabet. And in a language class, it's not like you're graded on how quickly you can produce all the different letters of the alphabet. But if you don't lay that foundation, then you can't get to the reading that you want to get to.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, that was, where my mind goes with it. And we actually, I don't know if you saw this, we actually interviewed Marianne Wolf on our podcast, and she was talking about some of these things, but it's super interesting. One of the things related to this, and this is your last section, is vocabulary acquisition. So this is related in the sense that if you can see a word and recognize its meaning very quickly, then you can read a larger text very quickly. And then you can free up working memory for all these other more fun processes. So in this respect, to begin with, what does it mean to know a word? Because most of us, in a Greek or Hebrew classroom, right, you're going to be given like a flashcard or a gloss. That's what you're going to do.
Right.
So what does it mean to know a word, and how is that parsed out differently in the literature?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, knowing the English gloss is really just the entry point. To know a word and to fully know it, it's just very multifaceted. You need to know the form of the word, its inflected forms, prefixes, suffixes that go with it, the meaning, and not just that gloss, but the multiple layers of meaning. You need to know its use. What words are used with it? In what context is it used? And each of these pieces have subcomponents also. So when you get that English gloss, when you start memorizing vocabulary, that's great and you need that, but that's just the starting point.
So would you recommend the English gloss? Because some people in the more communicative approaches within the biblical studies world don't want to use English, right? And they want to say, okay, like let's use Greek to explain Greek or Hebrew to explain Hebrew, and we'll never use an English gloss unless it's a break time during class, in which case you can come up to me and ask me what the word means, and I'll just tell you in English, which has been my experience. As you're trying to explain what chesed means to a class, and you're like doing all these demonstrations, and then you just ask at the end.
Right. No, there's definitely value to learning Hebrew in Hebrew, Greek in Greek, but sometimes the fastest way is to throw in an English gloss. The research actually supports the use of like flashcards. And if you want to do flashcards with like Hebrew on one side and English on the other, that's great. If you want to try to avoid English, you can use a picture, but not every word is going to have a picture to go with it. Like Hesed, how do you put that in a picture? So I don't think there's anything wrong with an English gloss. It can sometimes just be the fastest way to say, okay, here it is. Let's move on, get back into Hebrew or Greek or whatever it is.
Well, I think that's a really important point too, is that what we're not saying is that the English gloss is the meaning. It's just a gateway into the meaning, right? So you have to be able to have some sort of idea of what the thing is doing when you encounter it in text. If you just have no idea, you can't read the text, right? But if you do have an idea, then what should end up determining the meaning is the word's use and not the English gloss.
Yes.
And I think that's where people get
Yes.
confused is a lot of times we read English glosses into the text, right?
Yes.
But
this is what I learned.
right, exactly. This is what I learned. But like you're not reading Greek to or Hebrew, to regurgitate the English gloss, right? Like that's
Right.
exactly the opposite of what you want to do, right? You anyway, but yes, so you see a place for the gloss,
Mhm.
but as an entryway into what the word means.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so another area of study is in just how many words you need and how many words you need, like both in a text and in the language in general, just to comprehend normal everyday things. It's interesting that even in seminary classes, in my experience in Greek and Hebrew classes, there's actually been a de-emphasis on vocabulary because you can just look up words, right? You can just like use logos and
Right.
you can always just look up a word, right? But if you don't know the words, then you can't read, right? You can't
Yes.
interact with the language. And so there's in the SLA literature, there's like, okay, how do we get to, Law for Nation talk about like 5,000 words as fast as possible so that you can then listen to the radio.
Right.
And then you can start getting a lot of input and comprehensible input, and that will accelerate your learning further. So let's just say our goal is 5,000 words. That would give you the vast majority of words in the New Testament. And depending on how you count a word, it would give you a good chunk of the Hebrew Bible. What's the best way to do that?
Well, I've already talked about flashcards and using some direct vocabulary learning. Like word studies are great for really getting a deep dive into the meaning of a word and its use and where it goes and so on. But you also are going to need learning vocabulary in context, indirect learning of vocabulary, and extensive reading. Again, we're coming back to this, reading a lot of stuff is going to be a great way for building your vocabulary. There's a rule of thumb that with extensive reading, you need to know at least 95 to 98% of the words. First of all, to comprehend it, but then also to learn that added vocabulary, the other 2 to 5% you don't know. And that's a great way to go about it, but you've got to be sure that you know 95 to 98% of everything else to continue learning and building your vocabulary. And of course, you're reviewing words you already technically know, but maybe don't fully know. So there's that. But if the text has less than that 95 to 98%, then you're going to struggle too much with comprehension, and you're not going to have enough brain power left to be able to pick up the words you don't know along the way from context.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we tell people as well, 95, 98%. I mean, really what I think it tells us as a whole field is we just need way more of these texts that are baby Hebrew, baby Greek, because most people, never reach that level with the biblical languages. They never reach the point where it's, oh, I know 95, 98% of the words. And then they're expected to read and understand a text. And the literature says you just can't. That's just not how it works. Right? You have to know the words to be able to read.
Think about it. If you know all the vocabulary in that sentence, you can at least have a pretty good guess of what they're trying to say, even if you don't know all the grammar. But if you know all the grammar and only like 2 of the vocab, you're not going to get anything out of it.
Yep, for sure. So we talked about a lot. Obviously, we just went through your whole book in a very short amount of time. There's a lot more that you have said in your book and a lot more that could be said. What would you say? Let's, just say someone at the end says, okay, you've convinced me. I need to work on incorporating implicit knowledge, acquiring the language in the classroom, but I don't know how to do it. I can't speak the language. I can't read fluently. There are teachers out there that can't read fluently,
Right.
So what would you say to them who are hesitant to do this, but are convinced that they should?
Right. I would say start by building your own fluency. Find as much comprehensible input as you can get. So listen to recordings of the biblical text. You can find them online in various places. Read lots. Just keep reading every day. Read the Bible in your language, as much as you can. Those are great places to start building in your auditory learning as well as your reading fluency, so you can start building yourself up to that level. But then look for a friend. You might find a colleague who you can practice with, a friend who knows the language, talk on the phone in Hebrew or Greek or whatever it is. Or you could also enroll in like a modern Hebrew or a modern Greek class where they do help you increase your fluency in speaking and listening and that kind of a thing. So those are some places to start to get yourself up to speed to the point where you're ready to do this in the classroom. And then once you're ready, even if you're not fully ready, start where you are. If you can only do greetings in Hebrew, do greetings in Hebrew. And next time around, say, okay, now I'm going to add find page such and such, or whatever it is, or come to the board. I'm going to add this the next time around.
Yeah, that's great. I think it is, if you have been, sort of brought up in the grammar translation method, it's just hard to know, like, okay, what's the first step? But I
Right.
think that's great, to say the first step is you yourself getting fluent in the language, or building fluency. I mean, these are all, I think what people don't understand is language learning is a lifelong journey, even in your own language, right? I mean,
Yes.
I will look at, a medical text and say, okay, I'm a fluent speaker of English. I have no idea what you're saying to me. Just like there's
Right.
too many unknown vocabulary words. I haven't reached a 95, 98%, and I cannot understand what you're saying, right? And so that's the thing, is that you're not going to just arrive one day, but you have to keep learning new words. I mean, thankfully, honestly, both the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, they're so small, right? Like the amount of words that you need to learn is not very many to master the entire thing. So
Right.
there
Right.
is actually an end.
Right.
But yeah, just to start,
Right.
So do you have any final thoughts or recommendations for teachers, or, recommendations for people that are more interested in SLA, that want to, continue reading? Let's say they get your book. Where do you go from here?
Yes, I would say get my book, work on your own comprehensible input. And also, you might consider, besides the things we've already said, get a modern language textbook like Spanish, see what they're doing. It modeled some activities off of their activities and start using that in your classroom. Talk to other people at ETS and SBL. They've got sessions now that are dealing with these issues more and more. Sit in, talk to the people there, get some ideas, start generating some of your own materials, borrow what other people are doing. There's just more and more out there all the time of people in the biblical languages trying to do this. So you're not alone.
Yeah, that's great. And it is actually, what I tell people is one of the best times to learn the biblical languages, because there really are, there are way more resources today than there were. I mean, even 5 years ago, but definitely 10 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, you didn't have access to, the things that we have today. So thank you again for writing this book. I hope people can purchase it, published by Glasshouse. You can find it on their website, and start to incorporate these principles for themselves. So that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. You can also follow Biblingo on social media to discuss the episode with us and other listeners. And don't forget to visit biblingo.org to start your 10-day free trial of Biblingo.